summary of what this discussion is requiring of you, the lesson two discussion about the research questions, because it's asking you to develop your own research study and start from the beginning. And as a graduate student, I had a thesis and obviously have publications, and so this is very practical academic stuff here. So we want to make sure that we understand the variables, and mostly sociologists will study the demographics. That's sex, age, race, ethnicity, creed, all these factors that we have, and then you take those other variables and you see how they influence one another. You have to be careful because you can find these correlations that seem to make sense because on paper the stats add up. Like there's an increase in crime during the summer. Okay, there's also an increase in ice cream sales. Does ice cream cause crime? No. So that's what we have to look at and make sure that we're not trying to, make up something that's not there. I personally did a study on bereavement and religiosity. I wanted to see if people who were more religious coped better or didn't cope as well as those who were less religious. Well, first thing my thesis advisor said was, how do you define religion? Because of course in my mind I'm thinking spirituality as well, those who don't necessarily participate in going to church but they have their own relationship with God or an entity. But I had to take it down and I had to be able to measure this variable of religiosity. Now, how do you measure religion? Well, okay, you actually have to look at some of the behaviors and actions that they partake in. How often do they go to church? Again, this doesn't mean that they're not spiritual, but I have now had to narrow my focus on this variable. So, how often do they go to church? Are they a member of a church? Um, this is, did they grow up in a church? How often do they participate with church people about church things? So this is how religiosity has been defined. Now, bereavement. How the heck do you define bereavement? Well, that was actually easier than defining religiosity, I think. But bereavement is um, that right after the loss. So again, I have to make it measurable. Well, bereavement, you can't really put a timeline on, right? Freud gave us some structured timelines, and that backfired back in the 90s when they realized that some people aren't going to go according to these coping strategies. I'm sure you've all heard of Kubler Ross and the stages of dying, and they can be applied to the stages of grief. So if they didn't hit the mark, then they felt even worse because not only are they grieving, but they're not grieving correctly, air quotes. So, how are you going to define bereavement? So, I had to pick a group of people who had participated in a hospice grief counseling, and their partner or whatever relationship they had with that person who their loved one had been. It was a 3 month, 6 month, 9 month, and 1 year study. So that's how I had to define like bereavement meant the death of a loved one, and of course you categorize that. Um, so again, you want to make sure that your variables are, how does this impact this?